June 17, 1924, Archibald Thompson Hall was born in Ibrox Road in Glasgow, Scotland. His childhood was fragmented and he was socially excluded in his youth. As he struggled to make and maintain friendships, he would frequently not attend school and would spend his free time watching variety shows. Struck by the praise and adulation the performers would receive, he was driven by a desire to elevate himself out of his working-class background and disjointed home life. While he was still in his teens, he began having run-ins with the law and, according to reports, was on the police's radar from the age of just 15 years old. Was also bisexual, and his marriage had fallen apart soon after it had started. In the late 1940s, Hall left Scotland and traveled south to England. London was still under rationing, as was the rest of the country, and the rebuilding of the city wouldn't fully get underway until the 1950s. Hall traveled to Soho and soon became a firm fixture in the nightclubs. During that time, not only was homosexuality illegal, but members of the LGBTQ+ community were treated appallingly by both police and society in general. The London club scene, however, was more open. During that time, various gangs controlled different parts of the city, and this gave Hall an insight into London's criminal underworld, a life he was desperate to be a part of. His love of performing made him a consummate conman, and he soon began committing theft. Between 1945 and 1977, Hall had spent more time inside prison than out of it. Alongside his love of variety shows, cinema was another fixation for Hall. Upon his release from prison, he began using the name Roy Fontaine, named after legendary actress Joan Fontaine after he saw her in Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca. He would confidently pose as an aristocrat or a wealthy American and quickly perfected his skills as a con man and thief. He would introduce himself as Dr. Roy Fontaine to gain people's trust. And according to one report, he was jailed in the 1970s for selling secret papers to the Russians. In a letter, Hall explained that this was a miscarriage of justice and that he was an innocent man. On one occasion, he stole the invitation meant for his employer and impersonated him at a party at Holyrood House in Edinburgh. As he began to move up the social circles, he got a job as a butler in Dumfries, Scotland, working for Lady Margaret Hudson. Lady Hudson was the widow of Sir Austin Hudson, a former Conservative Member of Parliament. Hall made a good impression with those in the community, and he was described as polite and incredibly well-mannered. In 1977, one of Hall's former lovers arrived in Dumfries, throwing Hall's life into chaos. David Wright had shared a cell with Archibald Hall when they were both serving time in Hall prison together. The pair had had a sexual relationship, and Wright's presence in Dumfries was a major threat to Hall. David Wright was given a job as a gamekeeper and began doing odd jobs throughout the house. He knew too much about Hall and his past and threatened to reveal this to Lady Hudson. Wright also began to steal from the house, leaving Hall enraged. Wright stole some of the antique silver in a ring, but Archibald Hall told him he needed to return it, and this quickly sparked an explosive row. As the argument escalated, David attempted to shoot Archibald, but missed. In an attempt to defuse the situation, Hall plied Wright with alcohol before the pair slept together. Although the argument appeared to be over, Hall had made his mind up. David Wright had to die. The next morning, they decided to go rabbit hunting on the grounds. Before they left, Hall ensured that Wright's gun was not loaded. David Wright remarked what a lovely day it was. Hall, ever the performer, allegedly replied, "Lovely day. Shame this is the last day you will see." He then pulled his gun up and shot David Wright in the head. Archibald Hall had gone from a thief and conman to a cold-blooded killer. He buried Wright next to the river that ran through the grounds. When he would take Lady Hudson's dog for a walk, each time he would put more stones on where he had buried the body, so that the dog couldn't smell it. Hall told Lady Hudson that Wright had left suddenly due to being offered a job elsewhere. Soon after, Hall headed back to London. Lady Hudson was none the wiser about the sinister goings-on and gave him a glowing reference to help him secure his next job. In October 1977, he got a job as a butler for Walter and Dorothy Scott Elliott. Walter Scott Elliott was 82 years old and had served as the Labour MP for Accrington between 1945 and 1950. He was from an aristocratic Scottish background, and his wife Dorothy was also incredibly wealthy. The pair lived at 200 Sloane Street in the prominent and affluent area of Knightsbridge, West London. Like Lady Hudson, the Scott Elliots found him to be affable, polite, and developed a real fondness for him. Being part of their household gave Archibald Hall the opportunity to case nearby properties and seamlessly move about in their social circles. He intended to rob his elderly wealthy employers, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. He made contact with his former lover, an Irish woman named Mary Coggle, and asked if she knew anyone that could help him pull it off. She arranged a meeting, and in November 1977 at a pub in King's Cross, she introduced 53-year-old Archibald Hall to 39-year-old Michael Kiddo. Like Archibald Hall, Michael Kiddo had had an unstable childhood, and he also spent time in the foster care system. After moving around a lot, he ended up in the armed forces, but he was dishonorably discharged after committing a robbery. Kiddo had had 2 failed marriages and a daughter, and with no stable address, he moved around the country often. He would take on odd jobs where he could find them in an attempt to support himself. He had many run-ins with the law and was frequently in front of judges for committing petty offenses. Despite his long rap sheet, this wasn't the experienced accomplice that Archibald Hall had been looking for. But for Kiddo, this was the perfect opportunity to make some big money. Money that was unprecedented for him. When they met, Kiddo was on the run after robbing the pub he had worked at as a barman. The crimes that was talking about were a huge step up from the petty offenses that Kiddo had committed thus far. The dynamic between the pair was instant. Hall was in charge, and Kiddo did what he was told to do. Kiddo greatly admired Hall and was hugely flattered that he had been asked to help him in his criminal endeavors. After committing several robberies in the local area, they set about devising a plan to rob Walter and Dorothy Scott Elliott. They would steal little and often in the hopes that the vulnerable elderly couple wouldn't realize. This plan, however, quickly and rather spectacularly fell apart. In December 1977, less than a month after they had first met, Dorothy Scott Elliott walked in on Hall and Kiddo discussing their plans and what could be stolen from the home. Kiddo had no right to be in the house, and it appeared that their crimes were about to come to an abrupt end. In reality, they were about to escalate in the most appalling way imaginable. They both immediately decided that she had to be killed. Dorothy Scott Elliott was smothered to death while her beloved husband Walter was asleep upstairs. In murdering Dorothy, they had killed a popular socialite in the busy UK capital, someone whose disappearance would not go unnoticed. They knew they had to leave and leave quickly. They moved her body to the boot of their car before drugging Walter and driving to Scotland. So as not to draw attention to themselves, Mary Coggle dressed up as the deceased Dorothy Scott Elliott. According to the Daily Record, they convinced the confused and semi-conscious Walter to allow them to drive him to various banks, withdrawing huge sums of money. After traveling 400 miles, they reached Braco in Perthshire. After they pulled into a quiet road, they removed the body of Dorothy Scott Elliott and buried her. Walter was still under the influence of the drugs they had given him, and after burying Dorothy, they carried on driving. They took him to an isolated spot in Inverness. He was taken out of the car and strangled with a scarf. Believing he was dead, and Kiddo walked back to the car. But they began to hear a groaning sound coming from where they had left Walter's body. He was still alive. According to Hall, he sent Kiddo back with a shovel and told him to finish the job. Walter Scott Elliott was then beaten to death. 3 people were now dead, and the crime spree showed no signs of stopping. But the trio soon ran into problems. Mary Coggle insisted on continuing to wear Dorothy's distinctive fur coat, as well as her jewelry, which started to bring them unwanted attention. Desperate to escape, they headed to Cumbria and arrived in the small village of Newton Arlosh. They began to rent a cottage nearby, and Kiddo and Hall became regulars at the local pub while they attempted to lie low. Unbeknownst to the residents of this sleepy English village, 2 brutal murderers and their accomplice were now living in their midst. Hall told local residents that he was an antique dealer, another part of the web of lies he was spinning. During their time at the cottage, they had made several trips back to where the Scott Elliots had lived to sell off more of their antiques. They told the Scott Elliots caretaker that the couple had gone abroad unexpectedly. A few weeks later, on Christmas Day in 1977, a shepherd was walking down by the stream that ran past the village. It was here that he made a horrific discovery. He found the body of a woman lying in the water. She had suffered appalling head injuries and had seemingly died a very violent death. It soon became clear who it was. It was Mary Coggle. As the investigation into her murder got underway, a few weeks later in January 1978, Hall contacted the mother of an old associate and asked if he and Kiddo could stay for the night. They headed off to East Lothian, but due to a snowstorm, they had to stop mid-journey. On the night of the 16th of January, they arrived in North Berwick and booked a room at the Blenheim House Hotel. Norman Wright, who was the owner of the hotel at the time, said there was something about the pair he immediately didn't like. Listening to his instincts, he called the police as he thought they had fled from another hotel and not paid the bill, and he was worried they might do the same to him. The police arrived and checked the tax disc on the car. The tax disc didn't match the number plate. When the police said they wanted to speak to Kiddo and Hall, Norman Wright said they were extremely calm and willing to talk to the officers. It was reported in the Watford Observer that Hall had had the number plate changed as the original one had 999 on it, the UK emergency code, which Hall didn't appreciate. The detectives then took them down to the station to answer questions. Officers described them as calm and collected, with Kiddo being quiet and Hall doing all the talking. Hall was also confident in answering the officers' questions. During their interviews, he made regular trips to the bathroom, and on one of those trips, he escaped out the window and fled the station. Officers from CID came to remove the car, and upon seizing it, the duty inspector made a terrifying discovery. In the boot of the car was the body of a naked man. This had gone from a petty driving offense to a major murder investigation, but one of their killers had just escaped. Archibald's flashy style ultimately caught up with him. He was immediately recognizable as he was smartly dressed, with a red and white polka dot handkerchief in his breast pocket. And later that night, he was caught as part of a road check in nearby Wallingford. Finally, Archibald Hall was back in custody. When he was back at the station, he allegedly swallowed pills that he had concealed and subsequently collapsed. He was taken to hospital and later discharged back into the custody of officers. He was initially arrested for handling stolen items, giving police more time to build a case against him for murder. It wasn't long before he started talking, and officers could not believe what they were hearing. In the case of Dorothy Scott Elliott, both men began to blame each other. But what had happened to the woman who had brought Hall and Kiddo together? What had happened to Mary Coggle? In his statement, Hall had said that an argument had broken out about her refusal to part with Dorothy's fur coat and jewelry. Coggle was drawing and wanted attention to them, while Hall was desperate for them to fly under the radar. He explained that during an argument near the river, she had fallen off the bridge, cracked her head open, and died. But scientific analysis said otherwise. Officers believed that what had actually happened was far more deliberate. They believed that the argument had began at the cottage they were staying in, and that Mary Coggle had been beaten with a fire poker and then suffocated with a plastic bag. At the cottage, police also found blood stains and fingerprints that matched Mary Coggle. They also found linen that had the crest of the Scott Elliots on it. The men then drove her body to the river and threw it over the bridge. Then came another question. Who was the man in the boot of their car and why had he been murdered? The final victim was not a stranger to them. He was Archibald's half-brother, Donald. It is believed that after Mary had been murdered and before they fled to Scotland, they arrived back at their cottage and found Donald waiting for them. Donald was a pedophile who had just been released from prison. Despite being related, the pair had an extremely fraught relationship, and there was no love lost between the two of them. They told Donald that he could be part of their next job, which would include tying up their victims. Donald was persuaded to let them practice on him. Once he was restrained and unable to move, Hall used chloroform to render him immobile. Archibald Hall then drowned Donald in the bathtub. On the 16th of January 1978, the pair put Donald's body in the boot of their car and headed north toward Scotland. But why had he murdered his brother? According to Archibald's lawyer, the one person he cared about was his daughter Caroline. As his brother was a pedophile, his lawyer said he likely had killed him to protect her, although this has been called into question. He didn't regularly see his daughter, and she was barely mentioned in his later written autobiography. In his confession, he remarked how surprised he had been with Walter Scott Elliott's strength. During their interviews, it also became clear that Kiddo had, ironically, had a very lucky escape in being arrested. Hall had no loyalty to him and saw him as dispensable. Kiddo was likely going to be the next victim, as Archibald had planned to murder him too. When talking about why he had committed his appalling crimes, Hall's defense was staggering. He blamed Michael Kiddo for starting him off again on a career of crime and said it was all his fault. He also made a second attempt to take his own life. While in hospital, he finally confessed to officers about his very first murder. He went on to explain how he had brutally killed David Wright. Archibald Hall eventually confessed to the murders and led the police to the bodies of his victims. As the murders had taken place in both Scotland and England, trials had to be held in both countries. The case for the murders committed in Scotland went to the High Court in Edinburgh on Kiddo's 40th birthday. The confident and performative Hall was unusually silent. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. Uncharacteristically, Kiddo turned to the press bench and said, "Oh well, life begins at 40. Kiddo was convicted of the murders of Mary Coggle and Walter Scott Elliott and the manslaughter of Dorothy Scott Elliott and Donald Hall. Hall was convicted at courts in both London and Edinburgh of 4 murders. The murder of Dorothy Scott Elliott was ordered to lie on file, meaning that a judge acknowledged there was enough evidence to make a case, but it wasn't in the public interest to proceed, normally because the accused has acknowledged more serious offenses. In the summer of 1978, Hall was given 2 life sentences for the murder of Wright and Walter Scott Elliott at the High Court in Edinburgh. He was later given 2 more life sentences for the murders of Cogle and Donald Hall at the Old Bailey. In 1999, Hall wrote an autobiography called A Perfect Gentleman detailing his life and crimes. He stated in the book, "There is a side of me when aroused that is cold and completely heartless." He went on to cooperate in writing several other books too, including To Kill and Kill Again, The Chilling True Confessions of a Serial Killer, and The Wicked Mr. Hall. A film about his life was also due to be released, with acclaimed actor Malcolm McDowell starring as the titular monster butler, but the film was cancelled due to lack of funding. While in prison, Hall went on hunger strike several times and spoke of not wanting to grow old in his cell. On September 16, 2002, while serving his sentence, Archibald Hall died at HMP Kingston. A spokesman for the coroner's office said that Hall had died of natural causes. He was 78 years old. At the time of his death, he was the oldest prisoner serving a whole life sentence. Kiddo was eventually released, and his whereabouts are unknown to the public. The crimes of Archibald Hall were shocking, calculated, and cruel. 5 people lost their lives due to greed and ruthlessness, and many more fell victim to the consummate conman's lies. The chance checking of the tax disc had brought to an end an extraordinary chain of events that had left a trail of chaos and destruction. If they hadn't have been stopped, one can only speculate about how many more may have fallen victim. The terrifying thing about this case was that an innocent man almost received a false execution. The mysterious death of Daryl Johnson was thought to be resolved for the majority of 2 decades before heartbreakingly resurfacing as a cold case in 2001. 8 a.m. on February 24, 1982 was a typical day for all school children in Nampa, Idaho. That morning, 9-year-old Daryl Johnson was seen walking 6 blocks from her house to the Lincoln Elementary School, but she unfortunately never made it there. Her disappearance sparked reaction from concerned neighbors and friends who, alongside with her family, came out en masse to search for her in the whole of Nampa. However, the massive search for Darlin ended 3 days later, when a couple of fishermen found her body near the Snake River in rural Canyon County. According to an autopsy, Darlin had been sexually assaulted and had blunt force trauma to her torso and head. Male DNA and hair were also taken by the police from the crime scene. Almost immediately, 34-year-old Charles Fain was arrested in September on suspicion of raping and killing Derry Lund. A hair sample that Charles Fain voluntarily provided to the police, combined with the fact that he lived a block away from the Johnsons' family, led to his arrest. Fain denied having any part in the killing of Darlene after being taken into custody, and he also passed the polygraph test. However, despite his denial and him passing the test, he was still accused of killing Daryl Johnson. During his trial, prosecutors hinted at the possibility that a shoe trail discovered close to Daryl's body belonged to Fain. In addition, 2 informants from the prison said they overheard Fain confessing to the crime. The 2 informants also got a shorter jail term in return for their testimony. Fain steadfastly maintained his claim that he was innocent despite the evidence they mounted against him. He claimed that he was 100 miles away from the neighborhood where Daryl was killed. The other witnesses supported his testimony, but the judge did not rule out Fain as a suspect despite the absence of solid evidence and no reliable witnesses against him. Charles Fain's polygraph results were accepted as evidence in court, and the DNA technology available at the time was insufficient to establish Fain's innocence. Fain was found guilty on November 4, 1983, and was given a death sentence in March of the following year, but he was later imprisoned for nearly 20 years. In the year 1991, he was only 4 days away from being put to death, but surprisingly, his execution date was postponed. It was then acknowledged 8 years later in 1999, when DNA technology was a little more developed, that the hair DNA discovered on Daryl Johnson's body did not actually belong to Fain, but rather to an unidentified man. Fain was then cleared right away. He was discharged from the maximum security facility in Idaho in August 1999. Several years later, in 2019, detectives reopened the case, and by the next year, they used genetic genealogy to identify David Dalrymple as a suspect. He was 64 years old, and his DNA matched the sample discovered at the crime scene. Dalrymple was already serving a life sentence for kidnapping and abusing a child in 2004. He was formally charged for killing Daryl N. Johnson in January 2022. He is still being held in prison and could soon receive a second life sentence or the death penalty. Charles Fain, on the other hand, is happy to be out of bars and is glad that the perpetrator has finally been caught. He was given a sum of $1,400,000 to compensate for his wrongful conviction and the 18 years he spent in prison. Fain recently purchased a truck for himself using part of the money he received for his wrongful conviction. The case of Danilo Cavalcante. On July 3, 1989, a child was born in the municipality of Estu in the state of Maranhão, Brazil. The boy was given the common Portuguese name, Danilo. This child experienced a tough upbringing. He wasn't spoon-fed or comforted with bedtime stories. No one took him by the hand to school when he reached school age. Instead, like many children in his impoverished neighborhood, he grew up on the streets. The environment for adults and children in Brazil's favelas is marked by oppressive poverty, low living standards, and high unemployment. All these factors contribute to a thriving street crime culture. When growing up in such conditions, amid dirt, poverty, and lack of basic human necessities, one's instincts for self-preservation kick in. People survive as best they can or choose to. Unfortunately, most often someone who has known only violence from childhood may take the same violent path since they know no other way. Our story today delves into the horrific brutality and relentless obsession that can destroy lives. Such events unfolded recently. In 2019, Sarah Brando eagerly awaited the arrival of her younger sister Deborah and her two nephews, Ian and Yasmin, at the airport. After a failed relationship with her children's father, Deborah, who was 30 at the time, driven by a genuine desire to provide a better life for her children, moved from Brazil to Pennsylvania to live with her sister. The family quickly adapted to their new environment, enjoying their cozy home and improved living standards. Deborah Brando and her sister Sarah were inseparable. They worked together at a cleaning service and often stayed connected via phone calls throughout the day. Their lives were quiet and happy as they embraced their newfound circumstances in another country. However, an unexpected acquaintance altered their destinies forever. In 2020, while spending a day off with her children at a park, Deborah met Danilo Cavalcante, a compatriot who was 31 years old at that time. A trusting relationship swiftly developed between them. Danilo was attentive and kind to both Deborah and her children. Deborah fell in love with her Brazilian neighbor Danilo Cavalcante and believed she had found a dependable partner. After several months into their relationship, they rented a small house together and began living as one cohesive family unit. After some time, Danilo, whose temperament was often hot and emotional, began to lose interest in the apparent perfection of their family life. As he grew closer to Deborah, his jealousy and obsession intensified. Mistrust without basis gradually transformed into a need for total control over the relationship. Frequent conflicts erupted between the couple, often culminating in violence. Danilo would drink heavily every night and return home as a completely different person, almost like an angered animal. He demanded complete submission and obedience from Deborah, punishing her severely in front of her children when she resisted. Despite her strength and efforts to defend herself and protect her children, the situation became untenable for Deborah. Unable to endure such treatment any longer, she moved back to her sister's home. After numerous threats from Danilo, Deborah sought protection by going to the police and subsequently obtaining an order of protection from the court that prohibited him from approaching her. Despite her attempts to distance herself from him, Danilo pursued her aggressively, often resorting to threats of violence if she even considered ending their relationship permanently. Fearing for her safety, Deborah decided to investigate Danilo's background. She reached out to acquaintances in Brazil through social media and unearthed startling information about his past life and his reasons for coming to the United States. To her shock, she discovered that Danilo was not who he had claimed to be. On November 5, 2017, in Brazil, Danilo had fatally wounded a 20-year-old student named Walter Jr. Moreira dos Reis by shooting him 5 times near a restaurant in Figueroa for something as trivial as a car repair debt. Investigation revealed that the two men were friends before this tragic incident occurred. Following the crime, Brazilian authorities issued an arrest warrant after granting the prosecutor's office's request for preventive detention. However, Danilo managed to leave Brazil through Brasilia International Airport due to procedural disagreements within the judicial system that delayed registering this decision in the National Warrant Registry. This discovery left Deborah stunned as she realized how much danger she was truly in by merely being associated with Danilo Cavalcante. It wasn't until 7 months after the crime that Cavalcante entered Puerto Rico illegally. In June 2018, a warrant for his arrest was issued in Brazil. Upon entering Puerto Rico, Cavalcante obtained a fake ID and eventually settled in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where his sister lived. Upon discovering Danilo's true identity, Deborah issued an ultimatum: leave her alone or she would reveal his identity. Unfortunately, this decision proved fatal. On the evening of April 18, 2021, Deborah was walking with her children outside her house. The children were playing catch-up while Deborah chatted quietly with an elderly neighbor. When Danilo Cavalcante approached and pulled Deborah aside for a conversation, the neighbor looked on but did not intervene. The discussion initially appeared calm. However, at one moment, Cavalcante produced 2 knives and attacked her. Deborah fell to the ground as he stabbed her multiple times. Despite her children's pleas for him to stop hurting their mother, he continued in a frenzy, inflicting a total of 38 stab wounds. A neighbor witnessing this brutal act attempted to administer emergency aid and stop the bleeding while Deborah's daughter ran to get help and call emergency services. Deborah Brando was rushed to a hospital but succumbed to her injuries. Meanwhile, Danilo Cavalcante fled Pennsylvania to evade capture and remained on the run for several hours until apprehended by Virginia State Police. He was extradited back to Pennsylvania and placed under arrest pending trial. On August 16, 2023, in Chester County, Danilo Cavalcante's trial for first-degree murder commenced. The investigation revealed that Cavalcante had refused to accept the end of their relationship and had been intimidating Deborah through regular domestic violence since 2020. During the trial, Deborah's sobbing child testified, repeatedly recounting the terrifying events of that day. It took the jury only 15 minutes to convict Cavalcante. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Following the verdict announcement, Cavalcante was transferred to Chester County Jail in Pocopson, where he awaited transfer to a federal prison. On August 31, 2023, around 9 a.m., an inmate managed to escape from Chester County Jail. Utilizing a chimney, he scaled the wall between 2 narrow hallways and ascended through the chimney to the roof. Avoiding the barbed wire fences, he broke free. Surveillance footage captured him in the tight space between 2 walls in the exercise yard. He used his arms and legs to ascend upward, eventually running across the roof. From there, he climbed over the fence and pushed through the barbed wire to gain freedom. Prison officials were well aware of vulnerabilities identified after Igor Balti's escape and believed they had addressed them adequately. Officials thought that adding barbed wire after a similar escape attempt by an inmate named Igor Balti just months earlier would prevent any jailbreaks. Acting Warden Howard Holland stated that according to court documents in May, inmate Igor Balti had climbed onto the roof of the jail and jumped to a less secure location, but was captured less than a mile from the prison, within about 5 minutes. In response to this urgent matter, the prison was locked down, initiating a massive search for Danilo Cavalcante, considered particularly dangerous. Alerts were issued everywhere. Danilo Cavalcante, age 33, with black hair and possibly armed and very dangerous. The escape of such a dangerous felon gained significant media attention. The search for this fugitive was broadcast daily across all media channels. The Pennsylvania State Police chief overseeing the search held regular press conferences and briefings, providing residents with precise information about this special operation. He urged residents not to stay on the sidelines, but to take an active role through vigilance and observation to help determine the perpetrator's route. And it worked. About a few hours after the escape, Danilo Cavalcante was spotted walking along a road about 2 miles from the prison. With the help of reports from local residents, Cavalcante was seen on camera in the early morning hours of September 2nd. Police set up a search perimeter around the area, securing roads and railroads that run through it to prevent Cavalcante's potential escape, and put up a $10,000 reward for any information leading to his capture. Authorities began searching within 2 miles of the jail in the heavily wooded area of Pocopson Township in Chester County. A local resident saw the fugitive in a creek bed just days after the escape, but he fled into the woods before police could find him. The search continued and the perimeter expanded after he spent about a week on the run. A security camera captured Cavalcante at Longwood Gardens, a popular botanical garden nearly 3 miles from the jail, just south of where law enforcement initially searched for him. There are a lot of ravines, tall fields, high grass, and a lot of cover for a guy who is 5 feet tall and 120 pounds. Robert Clark, Deputy U.S. Marshal for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, stated on September 5th that in addition to tough terrain, Searchers had difficulty with extreme heat and humidity lasting for several days. After a week of desperate searches for Cavalcante, the number of officers involved grew from 250 to almost 400. The search team was strengthened not only in numbers, but also in equipment. Helicopters flying over began playing a recorded message from Cavalcante's Portuguese-speaking mother, begging him to surrender peacefully. The next morning, Cavalcante was spotted by a security camera on property located about 2 miles south of the prison. Police moved in and set up a new perimeter around this facility in Longwood, as well as nearby schools. These areas were closed while search efforts continued. Police conducted an intensive search over several days until eventually Longwood Gardens briefly reopened with limited access before being forced to evacuate and close again following another sighting of Cavalcante. On September 7th, law enforcement doubled the reward for information leading to his capture from $10,000 to $20,000. After nearly a week of searching, tension was palpable. Locals knew a man convicted of murder was on the loose. Yet, authorities had not disclosed how Cavalcante escaped from prison. In Chester County, Philadelphia residents were instructed by police to lock all doors and windows, secure vehicles, and stay indoors. CBS News reported that 34-year-old Danilo Cavalcante escaped from a Pennsylvania prison. The intense search pressed on until a significant development occurred on September 9th. Cavalcante somehow managed to breach the search perimeter in Longwood Gardens. He was seen on a video intercom, standing on the porch of a former colleague's home near Phoenixville, almost 20 miles northeast of the search area. Cavalcante cleverly altered his appearance. He shaved and donned new clothes and remained undetected as he moved across the state. He stole a van from a local dairy store and drove it to Phoenixville with hopes of getting help and shelter from acquaintances. On the morning of September 10th, authorities discovered an abandoned stolen van with an empty gas tank in a field in suburban East Nantmeal. The search area then shifted to the northern part of Chester County. Cavalcante's movements once again prompted changes to the search perimeter on September 11th. As investigators continued their efforts, Cavalcante was listed on Interpol's most wanted list, and the reward for information regarding his whereabouts was increased further. That night, emergency services received an urgent call from a local resident who reported that a man matching Cavalcante's description had broken into his garage. In self-defense, the homeowner fired multiple shots and hit him. Surprisingly, Cavalcante managed to escape and stole a .22 caliber rifle with both scope and flashlight attachments. Police arrived swiftly at the scene and discovered Cavalcante's sweatshirt and shoes nearby. Once they confirmed his identity and recognized that this dangerous felon was now armed, local authorities urged residents in South Coventry to lock all doors and windows, secure vehicles, and stay indoors whenever possible. This fugitive remains particularly dangerous, and his escape has deeply concerned area residents. Several school districts even canceled classes as precautionary measures to ensure safety. On the day after Cavalcante was seen on surveillance video, police expanded the search and urged residents to keep their doors locked. A new search perimeter was set up in South Coventry Township, which was tighter than before because authorities believed Cavalcante was now surrounded. The search continued throughout September 12th. Around 1 a.m. on September 13th, an aircraft with thermal imaging technology spotted Cavalcante in the woods. However, due to bad weather, the police had to wait until sunrise to approach, as the surveillance plane could not operate safely. The significant breakthrough occurred in the early morning hours of September 13th, when authorities found out that a security alarm went off just after midnight within the final search perimeter. According to Bivens, an officer of illicit drug enforcement, the aircraft using thermal imaging technology detected a heat signal around 1 a.m. shortly after the alarm was triggered. Ron Johnson, a retired Missouri State Highway Patrol captain, mentioned that technology played a major role in this operation. He said law enforcement faced many challenges for a long time, but managed to pick up the heat signal from a DEA spy plane just in time. At around 8 a.m. on September 13th, police found Cavalcante asleep with the rifle he had stolen from the home 2 nights earlier. Danilo Cavalcante, a dangerous criminal, tried to escape by crawling into thick undergrowth. However, a police dog named Yoda subdued him by biting his head and holding him until police arrived. Lieutenant Colonel George Bivens stated at a news conference that Yoda caused Cavalcante minor head injuries during his capture. Cavalcante was questioned by the police immediately after his capture. He revealed that he survived on watermelons and creek water and traveled only at night. He even admitted he almost got caught by an officer while hiding at one point. His plan was to steal a car and travel to Canada. Since returning to prison, Cavalcante has been charged with multiple crimes related to his escape, including burglary, trespassing, and theft. Following his capture, local and state officials, including Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, expressed gratitude to all law enforcement officers who assisted in the search for high-risk felon Danilo Cavalcante. Chief George Bivens, who led the search, discussed the multitude of challenges that law enforcement officers faced during the operation to locate Cavalcante. He highlighted the intense heat and thunderstorms that occurred in the area during the search. Additionally, he noted that each of the search perimeters was established in heavily wooded areas. The search team was composed of approximately 500 law enforcement officers, including Pennsylvania State Police, FBI, ATF, and U.S. Marshals, who thoroughly searched the area around the escape scene. In the wake of Cavalcante's escape, police set up a perimeter spanning several miles in each direction. The Chester County Jail Board, responsible for overseeing the jail, faced heavy criticism from local residents for their failure to prevent Cavalcante's escape. Residents pointed out that the jail had previously been given an opportunity to implement necessary security improvements after Igor Balti's attempted escape on May 19th. Those enhancements could have potentially prevented Cavalcante's escape, since he used the same method as Balti did. Following this incident, the prison has already terminated the prison guard who was on duty during Cavalcante's August 31st escape. Prison officials stated that this guard had a chance to spot Cavalcante during his breakout. In response to public concern, and days after capturing the fugitive, Chester County Jail announced they had installed a tin roof over the area where Cavalcante scaled 2 walls to access and eventually escape from the facility. Alongside this measure, various other security enhancements and improvements were also implemented. Clearly, there are questions that Chester County officials will need to address regarding how the suspect managed to escape, especially considering this prison's history, said Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro. He emphasized how crucial communication and cooperation among all law enforcement agencies and local residents were during this extensive search effort. Thanks to these combined efforts, Danilo will now never go free again. Christy Wesselman was born on April 19, 1970 in Glen Ellen, Illinois. She lived there with her mom, 2 older brothers, and a sister. Their town was considered one of the safest in the area, and Christy loved spending time outside. She'd spend hours wandering the streets with other kids from the neighborhood. At school, Christy was popular and had a lot of friends. She was actively involved in school life and even got elected as vice president of her class. On top of that, she played volleyball and softball. In the summer of 1985, 15-year-old Christy was taking summer classes at school and spent most of her free time hanging out with friends. On July 21st, Christy came home from school around 3:30 p.m. Right after getting home, she decided to walk to a local store to grab a soda and a chocolate bar for herself and her mom. Her mother expected her back in just a few minutes since the store was close by. But as time went on, it became clear something was wrong, because Christy wasn't coming home. At first, her mom thought she might have run into some friends and gone off with them. Back then, there were no cell phones, so she couldn't check in with Christy and had no choice but to wait. As evening set in, her worry only grew. She called Christy's friends, but none of them had seen her that day. Growing desperate, she headed to the store herself, scanning the streets along the way, but there was no sign of Christy anywhere. Christy's family spent the next several hours searching for her, but when there was still no sign of her by 1:50 a.m., her mother decided to contact the police. Officers quickly joined the search, starting by piecing together Christy's last known movements. First, they spoke with the clerk at the store she'd visited. The man knew Christy well. He lived nearby and had even babysat her when she was younger. He confirmed that Christy had come by around 4 p.m., picked up some chocolate bars, and left. She didn't mention where she was headed, but the clerk noted that she seemed happy and nothing about her behavior struck him as unusual. Police also found a few other witnesses who had seen Christy at the store, but none of them could recall where she went after that. Investigators spoke to all of Christy's friends, considering the possibility that she might have lost track of time while hanging out with some of them. But none of her friends had seen her that day. The police then focused all their resources on the search and began combing through the streets. But by that time, it was already the middle of the night, making the search even more challenging. Despite their determination, there was no trace of Christy. No clues, no leads, nothing. The search continued through the early morning, and by midday, a new group of officers took over. One of them suggested trying to retrace Christy's likely route. He guessed that she had probably taken the shortest path from her house to the store, a shortcut through a nearby field. Back then, there was a large vacant lot with tall grass between the residential area and the store. Walking around it would take quite a bit of time. For adults driving cars, it wasn't an issue, but local kids who frequented the store or the nearby McDonald's always took a shortcut through the field, where a narrow path had been worn into the grass. The detective decided to follow this trail. As he made his way along it, something unusual caught his eye in the grass. Pushing through the overgrowth, he realized it was a human body, and he quickly recognized Christie. He immediately called for backup, and the body was handed over to the medical examiners for further analysis. Forensic specialists combed through the crime scene for any evidence, but their search came up empty. No footprints, no personal belongings, nothing to help explain what had happened. The medical examiners determined that Christie had died from 8 stab wounds. They also found evidence of SA and collected the perpetrator's biological material. But in 1985, DNA testing was still in its infancy and not commonly used in criminal investigations. So with no way to analyze it, the sample was stored for future use. Christie's mother also helped police piece together another interesting detail. Christie had been wearing a pearl ring on her finger that day. However, the ring was nowhere to be found, neither on her body nor at the crime scene. Detectives concluded that the killer might have taken it and instructed all officers to keep an eye on pawn shops in case the murderer tried to sell it. With no physical evidence to work with, the police focused on finding potential witnesses who might have seen Christie or the killer near the field. They managed to track down several people who had used the same path around the estimated time of the murder, but none of them reported seeing anything suspicious. It was quite weird because Christie's body was just a few yards off the trail, although it was hidden by the tall grass, making it nearly impossible to spot. Investigators also learned that just a few dozen yards from where Christie's body was found, a family had been hosting a barbecue in their backyard. But despite being so close to the scene, none of them remembered hearing or seeing anything out of the ordinary. An employee at a gas station about 60 yards from the field also worked his entire shift that day, but didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. To the police, the situation seemed bizarre. So many people had been near the crime scene, yet no one saw or heard anything. Investigators theorized that the unknown attacker either followed Christie from the store to the field or encountered her on the path. He likely led her just a few yards into the tall grass and killed her, all without making a sound. Detectives considered the possibility that Christie might have known her killer, which could explain why there were no screams. After all, their town was small and many residents knew each other. Police began investigating all the men who knew Christie, but this effort led nowhere. They also compiled a list of men in the area with prior convictions for violent crimes. Several suspects were reviewed, but none of them could be tied to the murder. For several months, the police made little progress in solving the mystery. They continued following up on tips and investigating new suspects, but every lead brought them to a dead end. This dragged on for 3 long years, until an unexpected breakthrough came in 1988. By that time, DNA analysis was becoming a key tool in criminal investigations. Detectives decided to collect DNA samples from everyone who had been a potential suspect in Christie's case over the years. Many agreed to cooperate, and none of their samples matched the biological evidence found at the scene. But there was one person who refused to provide a DNA sample. Dana Henry, a 34-year-old man living near the field where Christie was found, had been on the police's radar from the first days of the investigation. At the time, Henry denied having anything to do with the crime. But now, his refusal to give a sample made detectives seriously question his innocence. The police decided to seek a court order to obtain his DNA. Henry appeared at the court hearing and continued to insist he was innocent. However, he was charged with contempt of court and held in a local jail cell for several days. Only after that, Henry agreed to provide his DNA sample. In the end, his DNA didn't match the killer's sample and Henry was released. Once he was out, he told reporters that he had been held in a jail cell without clothing and was only released after he gave in to the immense pressure and reluctantly agreed to provide a sample. Henry said he spent around $50,000 on legal fees, a significant amount of money at the time. He had to mortgage his home, which he eventually lost, and many of his friends and family turned their backs on him. Frustrated and angry, Henry filed a lawsuit against the police department, but it didn't seem to lead anywhere. Even after DNA evidence cleared his name, some people still believed he was guilty. Years later, Henry admitted to reporters that the whole ordeal had ruined his life, even though he was never formally charged with a crime. For another year, Christie's case remained at a standstill until 1989, when an unexpected twist brought it back into the spotlight. A judge issued a restraining order against a local man who had been bombarding the victim's family with tips about who he believed was responsible for Christie's murder. The man, named Willis, first contacted Christie's relatives in late 1985. He claimed to have information about the killer's identity and started sending them various leads. Each tip was investigated by the police, but every time it turned out to be either far-fetched or completely irrelevant to the case. This dragged on for almost 4 years until Christie's family couldn't take it anymore. They filed a complaint and a judge issued an order barring Willis from ever contacting them again. Following the restraining order, police decided to investigate Willis himself, but they found no evidence linking him to the crime. The killer's DNA was uploaded to the FBI database, but no matches were found. The case remained cold for many years. From time to time, the police revisited it, following up on tips, but they never got any closer to catching the killer. This went on for 3 entire decades. Over the years, the original detectives had all retired or moved on, and Christie's case had been assigned to a new team. Then, in 2015, something completely unexpected happened. One day, they got a notification from the FBI database. The DNA sample from Christie's killer perfectly matched a recently uploaded profile. The DNA belonged to a 62-year-old man named Michael Jones, who lived in a small town called Champaign, about 150 miles from Christie's home. Jones' DNA was added to the database after he was arrested for domestic violence. His wife had reported him to the police, which led to his arrest. According to an Illinois law passed in 2002, anyone suspected of a crime has to provide a DNA sample. Interestingly, the main advocate for this law was the state's attorney from the same county where Christie's murder took place. And this particular unsolved case had been a major factor in his push to get this legislation passed. As soon as the DNA match came through, investigators jumped into action, looking into Michael Jones. The first thing that stood out was that his name had never been mentioned in the case before. He wasn't a suspect, a witness, or even someone remotely connected to the investigation. The detectives simply hadn't known he existed. Michael Jones had a long criminal history. His first run-in with the law came in the mid-70s when he assaulted a woman. But for some unknown reason, he apparently avoided any real consequences. Just a year later, Jones attacked a 27-year-old woman, assaulted her, and left her in a hospital parking lot. When police issued a warrant for his arrest, Michael turned himself in. During his trial, he expressed deep regret for his actions and claimed he had a great respect for the law. That's why he surrendered voluntarily. Jones also insisted that he suffered from serious mental health issues and needed professional help. However, an independent psychiatrist determined that he was fully aware of his actions. As a result, Jones was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. As you might have guessed, Michael was released early for good behavior. He ended up serving just 6 years of his sentence and was back on the streets by 1983, 2 years before Christie's murder. What's even more striking is that his victim wasn't informed of his early release. Later, she stated that had she known, she would have done everything in her power to challenge the decision. A year after his release, Michael got married, but in 1994, his first wife left him and secured a restraining order against him. The reason? He had been showing an unhealthy interest in one of her young relatives. But despite this alarming behavior, no formal charges were ever filed. In 1999, Michael was arrested again, this time for assaulting a family member of his new girlfriend. Detectives also learned that Michael often went on long solo motorcycle trips and frequently visited relatives in Chicago. Given that Christie's town was on the outskirts of his route, it's possible he passed through the area while traveling to see his family. If that was the case, it would explain why he never appeared on the detective's radar. If Michael was just passing through for a few hours, tracking his presence would have been nearly impossible. Christie's mother said she had never heard his name before. When police first called her to ask about Michael, she didn't think much of it. Over the past 30 years, investigators had contacted her many times with questions, so this just felt like another routine inquiry. But everything changed when police obtained a fresh DNA sample from Michael while he was in prison and confirmed once and for all that he was the killer. They visited Christie's mother in person to deliver the news. After all these years, the man responsible for her daughter's murder had finally been caught. Before formally charging Michael with Christie's murder, detectives spoke with his ex-girlfriend and uncovered more details about him. She described Michael as someone with a volatile temperament. He could be calm one moment and then suddenly fly into a rage for no apparent reason. She also mentioned that he was obsessed with detective books and crime shows on TV. This information led investigators to suspect that Michael might not just be responsible for Christie's murder, but potentially other unsolved crimes as well. His frequent solo trips, criminal tendencies, and fascination with crime stories hinted that he might have known how to cover his tracks and avoid leaving evidence behind. After building their case against Michael, police officially charged him on September 18, 2015, and Michael denied any involvement in Christie's murder. The case eventually went to court, but the wait dragged on for 3 long years. The trial didn't start until 2018. Prosecutors sought a life sentence, but in the end, Michael decided to plead guilty in exchange for a lighter sentence. As part of the deal, he wasn't required to reveal any details about the crime, but with the DNA evidence, there was no question about his guilt. As a result, the judge sentenced him to 80 years in prison with a possibility of parole no earlier than 2095. In other words, Michael will likely never walk free again. Christie's family thanked the investigators for finally bringing the case to a close. Christie's mother also expressed her frustration over Michael's early release in 1983. She pointed out that if he had served his full 10-year sentence, he wouldn't have had the chance to attack her daughter, and Christie would still be alive today. Henry, the man initially suspected of the crime, also attended the trial of the real killer. In a later interview, he shared that the accusations had ruined his life, and even decades later, he still hadn't fully recovered. He hoped that seeing justice served would help him heal, but it didn't. Henry also revealed that throughout all these years, no one from the police department ever apologized to him, let alone faced any consequences for the damage they had caused to his life. The case of Heidi Firkus. Heidi Marie Erickson was born on December 14, 1984 to John and Alinda Erickson and was the youngest of their 3 children and their only daughter. She was known for her playful and artistic nature and lived her life to the fullest. After graduating from high school in February 2003, she continued her education at the University of Northwestern in Roseville. During this time, she was a regular attendee at Calvary Church in the city, where she had been involved since her early years. It was at Calvary Church that she met Nick Firkus, with whom she shared the role of youth group leaders, serving their community with dedication and passion. Nicholas Firkus was born on February 25, 1983 to Julie and Steve Firkus. He was a driven and ambitious young man who dedicated himself to his work as the director of operations at a reputable carpet cleaning company. Known for his well-rounded personality and strong work ethic, he had found his true match in Heidi, whom he met at their shared place of worship, Calvary Church, in February 2005. At the ages of 22 and 20, respectively, Nick and Heidi made the joyful decision to take their relationship to the next level. Surrounded by their loved ones and the familiar walls of the church that had witnessed the blossoming of their love, they exchanged vows, sealing their commitment to each other. To their friends and community, Nick and Heidi's marriage appeared perfect. They shared a love for travel, biking, and their church. They often hosted dinner parties for their loved ones. Heidi had recently started working at a financial firm where her father was employed. Their bond seemed to be growing stronger with time. However, behind closed doors, a different story was unfolding. On the morning of April 25, 2010, Heidi called 911 from her home in St. Paul, Minnesota, reporting a break-in. Only 38 seconds into the call, Heidi yelled no, and a gunshot was heard. 65 seconds later, Nick used Heidi's phone to contact the dispatcher saying, "Please, someone just broke into my house and shot me and my wife." Nick was overcome with grief, repeatedly crying and begging for help, saying, "Oh my Heidi, my wife is dead. Please get here." He also shouted no in despair. When the police arrived, they found Heidi unresponsive on the kitchen floor with a gunshot wound to her back. Nick was beside her, still on the phone with the 911 dispatcher, despite having been shot in the upper left leg. He was extremely upset and told the police that 1 or 2 intruders had broken into their home. According to Nick, he had grabbed his shotgun and tried to escape with Heidi through the back door, heading towards their detached garage. However, the intruder managed to take the shotgun from him and shot both Nick and Heidi. Sadly, Heidi was pronounced dead at the scene, her life cut short by the tragic events. Nick, meanwhile, was rushed to the hospital for treatment and was later questioned by the police while still in the hospital. Police asked Nick why he and Heidi left the safety of their bedroom to face the potential danger. Nick explained that they were trying to escape through the back door. After receiving medical treatment for his wounds at the hospital, Nick was released just 3 hours later and was interviewed again at the police station about the incident. At the police station, Nick provided a detailed account of what happened. He recalled watching a movie with Heidi and having a glass of wine before going to bed around midnight. Nick said he woke up around 6:10 to 6:15 a.m. when he heard the screen door open and someone fiddling with the doorknob. The investigators questioned Nick about locking the deadbolt, and he admitted that he and Heidi usually made sure to lock it, but he believed he had forgotten to do so that particular night. After hearing the noises, Nick retrieved his shotgun from the upstairs closet, which he had brought up from the basement a month ago because he noticed it was starting to rust. Although the shotgun was initially empty, Nick loaded it when he heard the noises. He then woke up Heidi, instructed her to call 911, and told her to leave the house and go to the garage where their cars were parked. Nick also shared that he and Heidi had a safety plan in place in case of trouble, which was to go to the garage where their cars were parked. Nick, who is right-handed, was holding a pair of jeans in his right hand and a shotgun in his left hand as he walked behind Heidi toward the garage. They stopped at the front door where Heidi retrieved her wallet from a table. Suddenly, the door burst open, and a tall, dark-skinned man rushed in. The intruder wore a dark hooded sweatshirt with the hood pulled tightly around his face. Nick dropped the jeans and the intruder grabbed the shotgun barrel. The two men then engaged in a physical struggle. During the altercation, the gun fired, and Nick said his finger accidentally slipped onto the trigger. He believed he hit Heidi in the back, causing her to collapse immediately. They continued fighting over the shotgun, which fired again, hitting Nick in the upper thigh and causing him to fall to the ground. The intruder then fled out the front door. Nick told investigators that Heidi was unresponsive, and he eventually lost consciousness. Nick told the police that his house was supposed to be foreclosed the next day, and he and his partner Heidi had planned to inform their parents and friends about their situation on the same day. According to Nick, they had fallen behind on their bills, and their house had been foreclosed on and sold to someone else. As a result, they were required to vacate the premises, but they hadn't shared this information with anyone. Their plan was to pack up their belongings on Sunday and Monday morning, leaving some items in the garage to collect later and then find someone to stay with temporarily. However, their plans were disrupted, and their peaceful home was left with an air of tragedy. The lives of Nick and Heidi were forever changed by the devastating events of that morning. The investigation continued, with law enforcement securing the area and interviewing residents. None of the neighbors reported seeing anyone leaving the Fergus residence. However, one neighbor, Brendan O'Connell, who was looking after kittens in a nearby house, told the authorities that he heard an argument, followed by gunfire. Nick begged for mercy, claiming a shooter had attacked him and a woman. After talking to police, Nick's lawyer hired an artist to update the sketch. Details emerging: an African-American male, 40 to 60 years old. The police initially searched for an unknown African-American male intruder based on Nick's description, but found no evidence or witnesses to support his story. Despite a thorough investigation, no one was arrested or charged in connection with Heidi's death, leaving the case unsolved for many years. Years later, a surprising revelation came to light. Over 10 years had passed since Heidi's murder, and Nick had seemingly moved on with his life, marrying Rachel and starting a family. However, when financial troubles resurfaced, Rachel began to suspect that Nick was hiding something. Rachel's concerns about their financial situation and Nick's evasiveness sparked her curiosity, prompting her to investigate Nick's past. As she dug deeper, she uncovered secrets and inconsistencies that made her question everything she thought she knew about her husband and his possible involvement in Heidi's death. Rachel was unaware of the financial troubles her husband Nick was hiding, similar to those he had faced with his previous wife Heidi years earlier. Her concerns prompted her to contact the authorities, which renewed interest in Heidi's murder case. Investigators began looking into Nick's second marriage to Rachel, whom he married in 2012. However, by the time Rachel spoke with the authorities, she had already divorced Nick due to his growing financial problems. Before their 2019 divorce, Rachel had recorded a conversation where she confronted Nick about his deception. She told investigators that Nick was repeating the same patterns he had with Heidi, including failing to pay property taxes. In fact, she had seen a letter warning that they would be evicted by 2020 if the taxes weren't paid. Rachel's decision to contact the police with her suspicions set off a chain of events that would once again bring the Heidi Fergus murder case into the spotlight. Sergeant Nicole Sykes, assigned to the case, listened carefully to Rachel's concerns and began re-examining the evidence. Sergeant Nicole Sykes of the St. Paul Police Department was determined to solve Heidi's murder, To uncover the truth, she made a bold decision to ask the FBI to analyze the 911 audio recordings. She hoped to find crucial clues that could explain what happened on the night of the murder. The FBI's analysis yielded a surprising result. It found no evidence of a third person being present during the incident. This discovery contradicted the husband's earlier statement to the police, leaving Sergeant Sykes and her team puzzled. If only Heidi and her husband were in the house, what led to her death? The absence of a third person increased suspicion around the husband's involvement in the crime. Sergeant Sykes was more determined than ever to uncover the truth and bring justice to Heidi and her grieving family. The FBI's findings opened up a new avenue of investigation, which Sergeant Sykes was committed to pursuing with increased intensity. The investigators obtained financial documents that disputed Nicholas Fergus's earlier statements, further implicating him in Heidi's murder. Fergus's account of the events surrounding Heidi's death kept changing. Initially, he claimed that an intruder took his gun and shot both him and Heidi. Later, he said that the intruder didn't take the gun, but his own finger accidentally pulled the trigger, hitting Heidi in the back. The crime scene investigation yielded no signs of a struggle, such as overturned furniture or marks on the walls, contradicting Fergus's account. Forensic analysis of the scene also disputed Fergus's version of the shooting, particularly the trajectory of the bullet that struck Heidi. Furthermore, Heidi's 911 call made no mention of an intruder, and there was no evidence warrant was issued for Nick Fergus on May 19, 2021, over a decade after Heidi's death. A SWAT team arrested Fergus at his home in Mounds View. The surprise arrest of Nick stemmed from Rachel's suspicions and the tireless efforts of Police Sergeant Nicole Sipes. This sudden development astonished many who thought the case had stalled and would never reach a resolution. As the legal proceedings progressed, the case details would be re-examined, and the truth about that fateful night would gradually emerge. At the trial, Nick Fergus maintained that he was innocent and pleaded not guilty. Many of his family members, including his father, claimed to believe in his innocence, stating that Nick's love for Heidi would have prevented him from committing such a violent act. However, the jury disagreed with their assessment. On February 10, 2023, the jury delivered a shocking verdict after deliberating for 10 hours. They found Nick, the person Heidi trusted most, guilty of her brutal murder. This outcome left everyone who knew Heidi in a state of shock and disbelief. The prosecution built a strong case against Nick by showing that he was facing severe financial difficulties, which they argued led him to kill Heidi to avoid shame and conflict. They questioned the truth of Nick's claim that a home invader was responsible, suggesting that he fabricated the story to divert attention from himself. The prosecution presented convincing evidence, including the lack of signs of forced entry and inconsistencies in Nick's account. Notably, there was no DNA or physical evidence to support the presence of an intruder, which raised serious doubts about Nick's story. Prosecutor Rachel Craker argued that Nick's inability to accept the truth of his financial deception led him to commit a shocking crime, sacrificing Heidi's life to preserve his reputation. In contrast, Nick's defense attorney Robert Richmond countered that it didn't make sense for Nick's financial problems to suddenly drive him to murder. Nick claimed that killing his wife would somehow boost his reputation, but this statement is illogical. After intense debates during the trial, the jury finally reached a verdict that would determine whether Nick would be held accountable for Heidi's death. The jury carefully considered the evidence, emotional testimonies, and legal arguments before delivering a unanimous verdict. Nick Fergus was guilty of first-degree murder. On April 13, 2023, the judge handed down the most severe sentence possible, life in prison without parole. Although found guilty, Nick still insists he had nothing to do with Heidi's death. He maintains his innocence even after being sentenced. When he was sentenced, Nick said, "I understand the pain and loss felt by everyone here today. Justice has been served, but it came at a great cost. A broken family, a betrayed community, and a life cut short." The verdict brought a sense of closure to Heidi's family and friends, but it also left them with the painful realization that the man they thought they knew was capable of such a heinous act. So you must be thinking, where's Nick now? Nick is currently serving his life sentence at the Minnesota Correctional Facility located in St. Cloud, Minnesota. Here's what drove Nick to commit the tragic act. The motive behind the killing remains unclear, but there are clues. In June 2009, Nick received foreclosure papers on their house, which was then sold at a sheriff's auction the same month. 10 months before Heidi's death, eviction proceedings began in February 2010, with a hearing scheduled for March 8, 2010. Nick attended the hearing alone. Initially, The lockout was set for April 9, 2010. But Nick called the attorneys claiming his grandmother was in the hospital and about to die. He requested the lockout be rescheduled for April 26, 2010. However, investigators found no evidence to support this claim. When questioned, Nick said Heidi was aware of their financial troubles, and that they had made plans together to move out of their foreclosed home and start fresh elsewhere. The truth behind a tragic event was finally revealed by prosecutors. A husband, Nick, had been hiding their severe financial struggles from his wife, Heidi. Tragically, before she could discover the truth, he took her life. Instead of being honest with his wife and working together to find a solution, Nick chose a devastating path. According to prosecutors, Nick's motive for killing his wife was his shame and fear of revealing their financial problems, which included $118,000 in credit card debt and 22 months of late mortgage payments. By killing Heidi, Nick avoided confronting the consequences of his own deception. In the end, justice was served, but Heidi's loved ones still suffered immense pain and loss. Unfortunately, no legal punishment could undo the harm or bring back the vibrant life that was cruelly taken. Sarah Foxwell was born on May 18, 1998 in Salisbury, Maryland. She grew up in a big family with 2 sisters and 4 brothers. Her mother also had 3 more kids from a previous marriage. Eventually, Sarah's parents divorced and her mom faced tough times, having to take care of all of the kids on her own. She had to work a lot, so the kids often stayed with relatives. Sarah was the middle child, always trying to keep the peace among her siblings when they were arguing and fighting. She always radiated positivity and usually succeeded in bringing her family together. In December 2009, when Sarah was 11, she temporarily moved in with her aunt and grandparents. Christmas was coming, and her mom was working extra shifts to buy gifts for every kid. Her aunt lived on the outskirts of Salisbury in a large farmhouse. The kids loved it there because of the vast space to play around. On December 22nd, everything seemed normal. With just 3 days until Christmas, the kids were in high spirits, running around the house, playing and just having fun. Their aunt ordered pizza for dinner, and around 9 p.m., they all started getting ready for bed. Sarah slept in the same room with her 6-year-old sister, Emma, at the end of the hallway near the back door. They chatted for a bit and fell asleep. The next morning, Sarah's grandpa woke up and went to wake the kids. He went into the girls' room but found only Emma there. Thinking that Sarah might have already woken up, he searched the entire house but couldn't find her. He told her aunt about it and they started to search every corner together. Eventually, they realized that Sarah wasn't in the house. Her aunt thought she might have gone outside to play in the snow that had fallen overnight, but she quickly realized Sarah's shoes and jacket were still at home. Then, her aunt noticed something strange. Sarah's toothbrush was missing from its usual spot in the bathroom. After searching the area around the house with her grandpa and finding no signs of Sarah, her aunt decided to call her mother. She rushed over and they contacted the police. The officers arrived within minutes and immediately began searching the house. Sarah's aunt told them that she always checked all the doors and windows every night before bed, and she had done so the previous evening as well. The police couldn't find Sarah anywhere inside the house or nearby. Upon learning about the missing toothbrush, the officers began to consider the possibility of an abduction. Maybe the kidnapper grabbed this item before leaving the house with Sarah, so they decided to check if all the doors and windows were indeed locked. As they approached the back door next to Sarah's room and tried the handle, it opened right away. Sarah's aunt swore the door was locked the night before and hadn't been opened since. However, she remembered they kept a spare key outside near the entrance. She went there and checked it, but the key wasn't there. This further supported the abduction theory. The fact that the perpetrator knew about the spare key suggested that he knew the family quite well. Another unsettling detail was that their dog hadn't made a sound that night, despite usually barking at strangers. Fearing that Sarah might have been kidnapped, investigators immediately initiated a large-scale search. News of her disappearance spread rapidly, and many local residents contacted the police offering their help. The sheriff appealed to the public through the media, asking them to check their properties for anything that might look suspicious. Dozens of local officers were called for the search. They also got help from neighboring towns' departments and even other states. They all hoped to find Sarah alive. Given that the perpetrator had taken her toothbrush, it might indicate his plans to keep her alive. So the police devoted all their resources to the search. Outside the house, they found their lead. There were relatively fresh tire tracks in the snow, indicating that the abductor likely arrived by car. Since all of Sarah's warm clothing was left behind, It was clear that the perpetrator couldn't have taken her on foot. Meanwhile, Sarah's relatives were brought to the police station where something unexpected happened. Sarah's 6-year-old sister, Emma, who slept in the same room with her, tugged at her grandmother's sleeve and whispered that she had a secret. She saw the person who took Sarah. According to the girl, she woke up to this man saying something to her sister. Emma didn't understand what was happening but got scared, so she pretended to be asleep. A few moments later, she saw the man leave the room with Sarah. This story shocked her relatives, but then Emma said something even more chilling. She recognized the man. It was Mr. Tommy. The adults immediately knew exactly who she meant. It was 30-year-old Thomas Leggs, the former boyfriend of Sarah's aunt. Although they had broken up a few months ago, he had spent a lot of time at their house and all the kids knew him well. The police were also familiar with Thomas due to his extensive criminal record. Over the years, he had repeatedly come to their attention for crimes involving women and girls. He landed behind bars at the age of 18 for assaulting a 12-year-old girl and receiving a 4-year sentence, but he was released early, just after a few months. Later, he received a 7-year sentence for assaulting another minor. However, he was released early again, this time after serving only 6 months due to his good behavior. Shortly after, he received a 6-month sentence for another assault. Then he attempted to assault another girl on the same day. His wife returned home from the hospital with their newborn daughter. The woman later divorced him and obtained a restraining order against Thomas because he had threatened to kill both her and their daughter. Another incident happened when a woman and her little daughter moved to the street where Thomas had lived. One day, the girl, along with her friend, was sitting on the porch of her house. Thomas approached them and told one of the girls that he had been watching her play in the yard and called her a wild girl. Then he grabbed a stick and began hitting her on the buttocks. The girl ran inside and told her mom about what just happened. The woman saw Thomas through the window and realized she had already seen his face. Before moving to this house, she had checked the sex offender registry in this area, and there was a photo of Thomas. The mother reported him to the police, and the case went to court, but Thomas managed to avoid any punishment for his actions. Before the trial began, the woman was asked not to mention the fact that Thomas was in the sex offender list and had previously been convicted of sexual assault. The reason for this request was the concern that mentioning it would bias the jury, potentially leading to an unfair verdict for Thomas. Just a few months before Sarah's disappearance, Thomas was arrested once again. He had broken into the bedroom of a 24-year-old woman in the middle of the night, undressed, and began pleasuring himself while standing next to her bed. After his arrest, he was released on bail. Thomas successfully hid his criminal history from Sarah's aunt, but she eventually learned about it. Nevertheless, he somehow managed to convince her that all these accusations were false and that he hadn't done anything he was accused of. Considering all of this, detectives had no doubt that Thomas was behind Sarah's abduction. Her relatives also noted that during the time the man was dating Sarah's aunt, he spent significantly more time with Sarah than with the other kids in the house. Back then, no one thought much of it, but after her disappearance, this fact seemed very disturbing. The police wanted to speak with Thomas, so they headed to his place. The man lived just a few miles away, in a shed on his parents' property. Investigators took him in for questioning and also obtained a warrant to search the shed. Inside, there was a mess and horrible living conditions, but no evidence linking him to Sarah's disappearance was found. However, the police discovered a large collection of magazines and DVD discs containing adult materials. The shed was literally filled with them. During the interrogation, Thomas repeatedly denied his involvement in Sarah's disappearance. He claimed that he was trying to deal with his problems, referring to his propensity for committing crimes against underage girls. According to Thomas, during the time he was dating Sarah's aunt, he deliberately avoided being alone with the children, so no one could falsely accuse him of anything inappropriate. When told that Emma had seen him on the night of the abduction, Thomas claimed that the girl had often made up stories before and he wasn't there. Detectives didn't believe a word he said, and it wasn't just because of Thomas's previous crimes. While they were speaking about the disappearance of 11-year-old Sarah, he repeatedly smiled and mocked. The sheriff even thought that Thomas considered his crime absolutely perfect and that the police wouldn't be able to prove his guilt. Thomas also claimed to have a strong alibi. He said he was at the bar with his friend until late into the night. Investigators immediately checked the story, and to their surprise, the alibi was confirmed. Thomas was indeed seen in the bar, but there was a catch. He left around 1 a.m., and since then, no one, including his parents, had seen him until around 7 a.m. During the examination of his phone, They also found that on that night, Thomas had sent messages to several women offering to meet up, but all of them declined. Despite all of this, detectives still couldn't crack Thomas. They hoped that the girl was still alive, so they put all their efforts into finding her. When they seized his pickup truck, the police immediately discovered several significant clues. Inside the vehicle lay Sarah's green toothbrush and a large lollipop. Investigators thought that Thomas could have used the candy to lure her into his car. The tire tracks also matched with the tracks left in the snow in front of the house on the night of Sarah's disappearance. The man himself told detectives that he hadn't been to that house in over a month, and now they had proof that he had lied. Despite the fact that Thomas continued to deny everything, the police still hoped to find Sarah. Hundreds of officers and volunteers continued searching the area, scouring the territory for many miles around her house. They checked abandoned buildings, forests, ravines, and bodies of water. Canine units with search dogs tried to pick up the girl's scent, while helicopters scoured the area from above. The police also received enormous support from the local community. People came to the police station and signed up as volunteers, despite the bad weather and the approaching holidays. Unfortunately, on that day, the search once again yielded no results. But no one even thought about giving up, and early the next morning, they went out to search for her again. Throughout this time, the stream of volunteers not only didn't dwindle, but grew even larger. In total, 3,000 people joined the search efforts. The sheriff even had to relocate the coordination center to the large baseball stadium because the police station simply couldn't fit such a huge number of people. Notably, among the volunteers were not only adults but also their children. They handed out water, hot tea, and food. Everyone tried to do their best, hoping that eventually it would help them find Sarah alive. Meanwhile, investigators obtained another piece of evidence linking Thomas to the abduction. As soon as the man was brought to the station, he was given a new set of clothes, and his own clothes were sent to the lab. Experts found foreign DNA on the suspect's underwear and compared it to a sample from Sarah obtained from her belongings. It was a complete match. Considering the fact that DNA was found on his underwear, detectives came to a grim conclusion. Apparently, after the abduction, Thomas sexually assaulted her. The day of the search also yielded no results, and on the morning of December 25th, Christmas Day, thousands of people once again went to look for Sarah. Despite the holiday, none of them even considered giving up. On that same day, investigators received GPS data from Thomas's phone. Unfortunately, there weren't exact locations, but rather just information about his phone connecting to specific cell towers. Police found out that on the night of Sarah's disappearance, his phone had connected to 3 towers, allowing them to determine the approximate triangular area where he must have been. Investigators focused all their efforts in this area, which was located practically on the state border, about 8 miles from Sarah's aunt's house. This area was mostly covered with trees. Hundreds of people combed through every inch of this territory, hoping for a Christmas miracle that Sarah would be found alive. Unfortunately, reality turned out to be much more tragic. Around 4 p.m., police noticed Sarah's body on the ground, almost at the state border. She lay on her back, with her arms raised upwards, pointing towards the sky. When medical experts began examining the body, even they were shocked. They confirmed the victim had been sexually assaulted. They found signs of strangulation but determined that the perpetrator had failed to kill her that way. In Sarah's lungs, experts found dirt, leading them to believe that the killer had attempted to drown her in a puddle. During this torture, the victim lost consciousness. After that, she suffered severe burns. According to the experts, the perpetrator may have left her lying in the forest for some time, went to get gasoline, came back, and set Sarah on fire. Traces of smoke were also found in her lungs, indicating that she was still alive at that moment. This also explained why her hands were raised and pointing to the sky. This sometimes happens when a person is exposed to fire. Such unimaginable cruelty shocked everyone involved in the case. Even the detectives found it difficult to believe that all these atrocities had truly been committed against the victim. But now, when they knew what had happened to Sarah, all they wanted was one thing: to secure the death penalty for Thomas. Despite the fact that he continued to deny everything, there was an impressive amount of evidence against him. After the discovery of the body, forensic experts found several hairs belonging to Sarah and particles of fabric from her pajamas on the front seat of Thomas's pickup truck, further proving his involvement in the abduction. With all the other evidence, this practically ruled out any possibility of him avoiding punishment. The wait for the trial stretched for more than a year, but it never began. In early 2011, the prosecution decided to offer Thomas a plea deal. Under its conditions, he would admit his guilt and receive a life sentence instead of the death penalty. Considering what he had done to Sarah, this deal might seem unfair, but there were a few serious reasons in favor of such a decision. The main one was that Sarah's younger sister would have to testify repeatedly in court in the presence of the murderer. The abduction and death of her sister became a serious challenge for her, and the trial could have affected her even more. Another reason for offering the deal was that the prosecution could not be 100% sure of securing a death sentence. If Thomas's lawyers had achieved a different verdict, he could have the opportunity to be released someday, which was not part of the terms of the deal under any circumstances. There was another problem. The state governor opposed the death penalty at that time, further reducing the chances of obtaining this sentence. In the end, Thomas agreed and told detectives everything they already knew without him. He admitted that he tricked Sarah into leaving her house with him. Then he took her away, sexually assaulted, and killed her. He received 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole and was transferred to a maximum security prison. In the few days, another inmate attacked him with a makeshift weapon during lunch, inflicting several serious cuts. Thomas survived, and prison staff took additional measures to protect him from other inmates who wanted to harm him. Sarah's case sparked outrage because the system repeatedly gave Thomas the opportunities to be released and continue committing crimes. Eventually, the state of Maryland passed Sarah's law, which mandates that anyone convicted of child abuse must serve at least 15 years in prison before being eligible for parole. The mysterious case of Johnny O'Barry. In a small American town called Bristol, Tennessee, Johnny O'Barry was born on August 26, 1983. She was a happy and friendly person who had many friends and loved to have fun at parties. When she was in school, she was also part of the local cheerleading team. After finishing high school, Johnny went to East Tennessee State University to study psychology and criminology. During her college years, she met Jason White, and they became a couple, eventually getting engaged right before they graduated. In late 2004, when she was 21 years old, Johnny decided to get a master's degree in psychology. This led her to move temporarily to Knoxville, another city, for her studies. While studying, she worked part-time at a children's educational center and discovered her passion for helping children. Her boyfriend, Jason, continued his studies in a different state, working towards a law degree. Even though they were far apart, they stayed in touch and planned their wedding. In Knoxville, Jonia initially stayed in her friend Jason Amami's apartment. They both went to college together and later moved to Knoxville. They shared an apartment with 2 bedrooms, and Jason let Jonia stay there until she found her own place. Jonia had 2 part-time jobs, one at a jewelry store and the other at a children's hospital. On the Sunday night of December 5th, after finishing work at the store, Jonia went to the mall to do some Christmas shopping. When she got back home, she wrapped presents for the children at the educational center, talked to her neighbor, and then went to her room. She also spoke to her boyfriend on the phone before going to bed. Around 4 in the morning, Jason Amami heard a scream from a woman. He thought Jonia was having a bad dream, so he went to her room. But instead, he found a stranger with a knife. The stranger attacked Jason and they had a fight. Eventually, Jason managed to push the attacker away and ran out of the apartment. He went to the nearest convenience store, which was almost a kilometer away, to call for help. When the store clerk saw Jason, who was covered in blood, they called 911. Jason explained what had happened to the police when they arrived. The police went to their apartment and found Jonia in the hallway that connected 5 apartments. She was still alive, but barely conscious. When they asked her about the attacker, she could only give weak clues. The police searched the whole building and the area nearby, but they couldn't find the attacker. They rushed Jonia to the nearest hospital, but the doctors couldn't save her, even though they tried their best. The doctor said she had more than 20 stab wounds, and it was very unlikely she could survive. As for Jason, he had 8 wounds from the attacker, but only one was very serious. He got medical help and his life was not in danger. Meanwhile, the detectives started to investigate the crime scene. They found blood in the hallway, showing that Jonia had tried to ask her neighbors for help, but no one had opened their doors. Right next to Jonia's room, they found the murder weapon, which turned out to be a kitchen knife that belonged to Jason. The attacker had used it with such force that it got bent and damaged. The police also found blood near the back door of the apartment and on the stairs leading to the street. Since Jason and Jonia had left through the front door, the detectives thought the most likely explanation was that the killer had escaped through the back door. In Jason's room, they discovered another clue, a partial footprint, which the attacker might have left when he followed Jason and attacked him. Because of the brutal way the attacker had taken Jonia's life, the police suspected that the motive behind the crime was personal. At first, the detectives started looking into Jonia's boyfriend, even though he was far away, about 1,000 kilometers from Knoxville. But all his friends and family said that Jonia and her boyfriend had a wonderful relationship, and he had no reason to commit such a cruel crime. He found out about Jonia's death when her mother called him at 10 in the morning. He said that after hearing the news, he fainted and took a long time to recover. He was in no condition to do anything, so he had to ask his neighbor to help him book a plane ticket and pack his suitcase. The investigators carefully checked his alibi and realized that he couldn't have physically traveled to Knoxville and back by morning. So they ruled him out as a suspect and turned their attention to Jonia's neighbor instead. In contrast to the victim's boyfriend, this neighbor had no solid alibi and had been inside the apartment with her, raising suspicions that he might be the culprit. Friends and family of Jonia were also skeptical of him. Some believed he could be the likely killer, while others accused him of fleeing the apartment, leaving Jonia behind. This suspicion ran so deep that the victim's parents didn't even want him to attend her funeral. Shortly after Jason was released from the hospital, investigators began questioning him. He stuck to his initial account. He heard screams, saw an unfamiliar man, and was attacked. After managing to fend off the attacker, Jason rushed to the front door and out into the street, seeking help from the neighbors. He believed that Jonia had also managed to escape the apartment because he couldn't hear her screams. However, the police had reservations about accepting this version of events. What initially raised doubts about Jason were his injuries. 7 of the 8 wounds were superficial, and the last one on his right arm could have been acquired either while defending himself or during an attack. Additionally, investigators found no signs of forced entry into the apartment, suggesting that the person responsible might have been inside already. Jason claimed that he had taken out the trash through the back door that night, but couldn't remember if he had locked it or not. Detectives continued to press him, paying close attention to which door he used to exit the apartment onto the street. Jason insisted that he had left through the front door, but the police suspected he might be lying. If Jason had indeed exited through the back door, it would explain the presence of bloodstains near the door leading to the stairs, further raising suspicions against him. Moreover, the police accused him of using and selling illegal drugs and of being aggressive when he couldn't get his fix. The young man denied all these allegations, but investigators continued to level various charges against him. After several hours at the police station, the detectives proposed a polygraph test of him. Surprisingly, Jason agreed. The investigators brought in an expert who asked him leading questions, and at the end of the session, they informed him that he had failed the test, indicating that he was providing false answers. Upon hearing this, Jason became emotionally distraught, shouting that he had nothing to do with the crime, that his life was in danger, and that the real criminal was still on the loose. However, the detectives remained unconvinced. Nevertheless, they couldn't charge him with the murder due to the lack of concrete evidence. They had to wait for laboratory experts to complete their examination of the few pieces of evidence found in the apartment, and an unexpected twist soon emerged. During their analysis of the murder weapon, the knife, they discovered 3 DNA samples, those of the deceased girl, Jason, and an unidentified man. Additionally, the unknown man's DNA was found in Jonia's room on the back door handle and on the staircase used by the criminal to exit onto the street. Furthermore, they uncovered a fingerprint on the knife handle marked by the victim's blood. That did not match Jason's fingerprint. These discoveries led the police to doubt that Jason was the murderer. The evidence strongly indicated that another person had been in the apartment that night. However, when they checked the DNA sample against existing databases, they found no matches. Even though investigators had ruled out Jason as a suspect, public opinion continued to cast doubt on him, accusing him of leaving his girlfriend behind and fleeing instead of protecting her. Furthermore, Jason started experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. A significant development soon came to light. It was revealed that the polygraph operator had misinterpreted the test results, and there was no indication that Jason was lying. Additionally, there was no concrete evidence linking the young man to illegal substances. It had been used as leverage, but more importantly, the severity of Jason's injuries had been initially underestimated. In reality, Jason had suffered serious damage to his lung and neck with little hope for a full recovery. Due to these inaccuracies in police reports, the insurance company only covered 25% of his treatment costs, leaving Jason facing severe financial hardship. Once the police no longer considered him a suspect, they began questioning Jason as a witness. From his account, they managed to create a rough description of the attacker. The situation was complicated by the fact that Jason hadn't gotten a clear look at the assailant's face. The apartment was dimly lit, and the attacker had pounced on him as soon as he exited the room. The investigators also stumbled upon something intriguing in Jonia's room: a cap along with discs and a stereo player near the back staircase. Initially, they thought these items might belong to either the victim or Jason, but Jason denied any connection to them. According to him, none of these items were in his apartment, suggesting they were left behind by the killer. The investigators shared a rough sketch of the suspect with the media, and after it was publicized, the police received hundreds of leads. People reported individuals who vaguely resembled the sketch, prompting detectives to pursue each of these leads. One lead stood out to the investigators. They learned about a group of teenagers in the area who had been breaking into houses with the intent to steal. One of these teenagers, a 19-year-old named Michael, bore a resemblance to the suspect's sketch. The police initiated a search for him, which was complicated because he was already wanted for theft. Now, with the possibility of his involvement in a murder, 2 police units joined the search for Michael. They eventually located him and brought him in for questioning. The investigators immediately focused on Michael's shoes, which had a tread pattern similar to the footprint left by the killer. They collected a DNA sample and fingerprints from Michael and sent them to the experts for analysis. Meanwhile, they interrogated him, and during this process, they received an unexpected revelation. Michael quickly admitted that he and a friend had indeed entered Jonia's apartment that night. According to his account, they had planned to steal valuable items, but his friend had taken a knife and attacked Jonia. However, the detectives soon began to doubt Michael's story. Firstly, the details he provided didn't align with the actual events. Secondly, there was no evidence of the presence of 2 strangers at the crime scene. The laboratory results further confirmed their skepticism. Michael's DNA and fingerprints did not match those found at the murder scene. The same held true for his shoes. The tread pattern did not match the one in Jason's room. Ultimately, the police concluded that Michael had fabricated the story. While it may sound unusual, such false admissions occur relatively frequently in high-profile cases. Some individuals falsely claim guilt for various reasons, including seeking attention or hoping for a reward for information. It remains unclear what motivated Michael, but his story turned out to be entirely untrue. Following that, investigators interviewed over 1,000 potential suspects and gathered around 400 DNA samples, but none of them matched the evidence. Early in the investigation, a reward had been offered for information leading to the case's resolution. As each month passed, the reward amount increased, and by December 2005, 1 year after the murder, it had reached $60,000. Adding to this, the state governor chipped in an additional $20,000 from his own funds, drawing even more public attention to the case. Despite the abundance of leads, all of them eventually led to dead ends, and the case remained unsolved for several years. In 2007, the victim's parents decided to take action by seeking changes in state legislation. They found it perplexing that the fingerprints and DNA of the murderer were not in any databases. Given the brutality of the crime, the parents refused to believe it was the perpetrator's first offense. They later discovered that according to Tennessee laws, fingerprints and DNA samples were only collected from convicted criminals. Jonia's parents were determined to change this. They played an active role in crafting a new law that mandated the collection of these samples from all individuals arrested for violent crimes. Authorities supported this initiative, and the law was enacted in May 2007. 2 months later, a breakthrough occurred in the case. The police arrested Taylor Lee Olson, a 22-year-old, for violating the terms of his probation. Olson had a long history of criminal activities, primarily involving theft, check forgery, and auto theft, and he had been arrested multiple times before. Surprisingly, his fingerprints and DNA had never been collected, even though he had a history of run-ins with the law. Olson lived with his girlfriend and their newborn daughter, but his criminal activities persisted. It was revealed that Olson had already come to the investigators' attention 5 months earlier when they received a tip about his possible involvement in the murder. However, for reasons unknown, the police had not pursued DNA samples for analysis at that time. Nevertheless, with his new arrest for probation violation, they finally decided to question him about Jonia's case. Olson eventually confessed his involvement in the murder and willingly provided a DNA sample. When the lab results came in, it was confirmed that Taylor's DNA was a complete match with the sample found in the victim's apartment. Following this, they collected his fingerprints, which also matched the fingerprint on the murder weapon. Olson was subsequently arrested, and detectives began to question him. Initially, Olson said he was not guilty, but he eventually decided to confess to his actions. Taylor claimed that on that night, he had intended to steal Jonia's car and had entered her apartment through the back door to find the car keys. When he entered her room, she woke up and began screaming. In response, Olson grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed her multiple times. However, he insisted that he hadn't intended to kill anyone and it had all occurred accidentally. Detectives had doubts about the truthfulness of some details and leaned towards believing that Taylor had premeditated the murder. It was possible that he had been stalking the victim for some time, indirectly supported by the fact that Jonia's friends had reported someone following her in a car. At the time, no evidence was found to substantiate this, but after Olson's arrest, it seemed increasingly plausible. Despite this, there was little doubt about his culpability. His DNA and fingerprints were present on the murder weapon, strongly indicating his involvement. Olson's trial was slated to commence in mid-2008, and by that point, he had already retained a lawyer. Apparently, his legal counsel advised him to retract his confession, and Taylor presented a new version of events to the detectives. Now he claimed that he had entered Jonia's apartment with his friend named Noah Cox. According to this revised account, when Olson entered Jonia's room to retrieve the car keys, she allegedly woke up, seized a knife, and stabbed him several times. Olson then fled through the back door while his friend entered Jonia's room, disarmed her, and killed her. This new narrative raised suspicions among the police. They found no fingerprints or DNA from other individuals at the crime scene, making it appear unlikely that anyone else was involved. Detectives awaited the start of the trial, but it never occurred. On March 28, 2008, Taylor Olson took his own life in his prison cell. Alongside him, several suicide notes were discovered, addressed to his family, Jonia's relatives, and the police. In the note to the detectives, he once again alleged that his friend Noah Cox was the actual perpetrator and also apologized to Jonia's family and his own. Detectives continued to believe that Olson was responsible for the murder, and repeatedly questioned No. However, they found no evidence implicating him. Jonia's parents also remained skeptical, believing that Olson was lying. In their view, if Taylor was truly innocent, he wouldn't have taken his own life. It seemed more likely that he simply did not want to spend the rest of his life in prison. Furthermore, for several months following his initial confession, Olson had consistently maintained that he had entered the apartment alone, and that there was no one else with him. The sudden change in his story to shift blame onto his friend raised further doubts. Case of Soni Millbrook. Soni Millbrook was born in Memphis, Tennessee, USA on February 15, 1981. She grew up in a close-knit family with 2 sisters, 3 brothers, and a large extended family, which allowed her to form a strong bond with her cousin Jenny during her teenage years. In 1998, at the age of 17, Soni became a popular student at her high school. The same year, she met Lelf Moody, a man in his 20s, and began a romantic relationship with him. Unfortunately, the relationship turned out to be abusive, and Elfa's violent behavior left visible marks on Soni's body. Despite this, they had 4 children together, 3 girls and a boy named after Elf. A year later, in 1999, Soni's mother noticed a bruise on her chest. Soni confessed that the bruise was caused by her friend, Leith, who was controlling and often tried to isolate her from her friends and family. In the same year, Soni moved into an apartment in the Fraser neighborhood of Memphis. However, her new home was soon vandalized, with furniture slashed, clothes missing, the television destroyed, food smeared on the walls, and personal hygiene products scattered everywhere, including down the stairs. On the mirror, someone had written, "Kiki loves you" in red nail polish, with Kiki being Leith's nickname. On October 31, 2000, Soni, her cousin Pamela, and Leith went to a bar called Mirage. While they were there, Leith slapped Soni and threw a drink in her face. Soni and Pamela left the bar and sat in the car, where Soni was visibly shaken and trembling. She asked Pamela to take her home before Leith arrived. Once home, Soni locked and chained the door. An hour later, Leith showed up, yelling and banging on the door. Pamela finally got Leith to leave by threatening to call the police. After Soni calmed down, her cousin left her alone at home. However, later that evening, Pamela got a call saying that Soni was in the hospital. Somehow, Leith had managed to get into the house, and when Soni tried to end the relationship, he violently retaliated. He tore her clothes, beat her on the head, face, chest, arms and thighs, leaving her with bruises all over her body, a loose tooth, and even temporarily losing consciousness after being choked until she passed out by Leith Moody. Not long after, Sony discovered Elf Moody's birth control pills in her apartment, and he assaulted her again. By late 2008, when Sony was 27, she was working at a Christian academy. She was a reliable employee who always arrived on time, so when she missed work or requested time off, it was usually for significant reasons. One day, she called her employer to say she couldn't come in because her face was badly bruised, and she didn't want the children to see her like that. The director allowed her to wear sunglasses inside the academy, and Sony confided in her boss about how her boyfriend had once chased her in his car, trying to force her off the road. Leith Moody's violence wasn't limited to Sony and their children. In April 2008, he was found parked in an SUV with a firearm, despite being prohibited from possessing one, as a convicted felon. He had already served 2 years in prison for theft, and another 3 for drug possession with intent to sell. On October 6, 2008, the situation between Sony and her boyfriend Leith reached a crisis point. After failing to show up at the academy, Sony sent a distressing text message to her boss at 5 p.m., stating that Leith was holding her hostage in her own home and had been beating her all day. She provided her address, prompting her boss to alert the police. 2 officers responded to the call and arrived at the residence. When they knocked on the door, it was locked from the inside, and there was no response. The fire department was called to break down the door, and upon entering the apartment, the officers saw Leith jumping out of an open window. At the back of the apartment, Sony stood in the hallway, visibly distraught and unable to speak. Her 4 children were with her, creating a heart-wrenching scene. Her face and neck were covered in bruises and scratches. Once she calmed down, Sony recounted the events that had unfolded. She and Leith had started arguing, and he had refused to let her leave the house. Sony explained that they had not answered the door earlier, because Leith had forbidden her or the children from approaching it or the windows. He had even hurt one of their children by grabbing him and had prevented her from taking him to the hospital. Sony detailed the physical and verbal abuse she had suffered at Leith's hands, including being choked with a baby blanket until she lost consciousness. When the police arrived, Leith had threatened to suffocate her again, vowing to kill her next time. Although the officers searched the area, they were unable to find Leith. Sony and her children eventually left the house in her car. 3 days after the incident, Sony applied for a restraining order against Leith, fearing for her life and wanting to prevent any further contact with him. However, she failed to attend the court hearing on October 23rd, which meant the protection order was never granted. 6 months later, on March 10, 2009, Sony and Leith were still in contact. On that day, Leith was supposed to pick up the children for a doctor's appointment, but instead, he started a fight with Sony, accusing her of having a new boyfriend. The argument quickly escalated, with Leith slapping her, pulling her hair, and yelling death threats as she tried to escape. Sony managed to break free and ran out of the apartment, with Leith chasing after her. He didn't catch her, but instead grabbed their youngest child, an infant, and drove off at high speed. A police patrol, responding to the domestic disturbance, arrived just as Leith was fleeing. The officers attempted to stop him, but he evaded them and escaped. By early 2010, Sony, then 28 years old, was studying at Southeast Tennessee Community College. Her 5th child was 9 weeks old and in fragile health, requiring her to stay home and care for him. In January, Sony and their children moved into the Budget Lodge Motel in Memphis. On the very day they moved in, their arguments were so loud that the motel staff intervened, as they were disturbing other guests. Unfortunately, peace remained elusive, as their fights continued to disturb the neighbors and the management with excessive noise. On January 22nd, a hotel security guard witnessed Leith in a highly agitated state when he arrived at high speed in Sony's car. He began shouting at her while she stood on the 2nd floor balcony with their children. During the heated argument, Leith threw a bag of groceries at her. The security guard intervened, telling Leith that he needed to keep the noise down and refrain from throwing objects, and that the argument should be continued inside their room. However, Leith responded by telling the guard to mind his own business, locked the car and walked away, with the guard following him to a 3rd floor room that was not registered under anyone's name. When the guard asked Leith to hand over any hotel keys he had, Leith surprisingly produced keys to 3 different rooms. Despite not being registered as a guest, the following day Leith, Sony and their children moved to room 222. That evening, the night manager asked Leith to leave, which he did, but he soon returned. The confrontations persisted for a few more days until the same security guard, who had repeatedly warned them, finally asked Leith to vacate the property permanently. As Leith went to the parking lot, the receptionist attempted to calm him down, and the guard warned him not to return that night. Leith got into the car and drove away. On January 26th, Sony privately shared with Pamela that a lot was going on in her life and that she was currently staying at a motel. She hinted that she had something important to confide in Pamela and promised to get in touch if she ended up leaving the motel or if her boyfriend did. The next day began like any other, with Sony taking her younger kids to daycare and dropping off her oldest at school around 11 a.m. However, things took a turn when the housekeeping manager knocked on Sony's door, speaking to her through the window, to inform her that they needed to settle their bill or leave the hotel room. He returned several times that day, looking for a response. At around 2:30 p.m., Leith answered the door, telling the manager that his mother would be back soon with the money they owed. But when the hotel security guard checked room 222, he found it empty, with children's clothes, bags, and various items scattered all over the floor. One of the beds was neatly made, which seemed out of place given the state of the room. Later that day, Sony failed to pick up her eldest daughter from school, which was unusual. The school secretary called Christine, the child's maternal grandmother, to come and get her. Christine tried calling Sony, but there was no answer. Growing worried, she discovered that her other grandchildren were still at daycare. Convinced something was wrong, Christine asked her husband to pick up the younger kids while she went to the school. They eventually contacted the police, who arrived at the house around 10:30 p.m. and filed a missing persons report. On January 28th, the housekeeping manager re-entered room 222, which was now vacant, to collect and label the personal belongings that the previous tenants had left behind, apparently to avoid paying their bill. The room contained piles of clothing and a large trash bag, which were both taken to the storage area. After emptying the room, it was thoroughly cleaned and readied for new guests. The following day, on January 29th, James and Rhonda Sargent moved into room 222. Upon moving in, the new tenants immediately noticed a strong, unpleasant odor in the room. They attempted to mask it by burning incense, but this effort was unsuccessful. During their search for the source of the smell, they discovered that the previous tenants had also tried to hide it, as evidenced by the scented tissues they found stuck in the tiles and ceiling vents. The smell was most pronounced when someone sat on the bed. On January 29th, the Memphis Police Department's Missing Persons Unit visited the hotel to ask about Sony's whereabouts, as it was the last place she was seen. However, the officers did not search room 222. Leith was found on February 2nd at around 7 p.m. in Sony's car, which was parked at a shopping center. He was arrested for stealing the vehicle and held in police custody for 48 hours. During that time, he was questioned about Sony's disappearance. Leith said the last time he saw her was on January 26th, when they met at 7 a.m. in the hotel parking lot, went to the room, were intimate, and then went back outside. According to Leith, Sony let him take her car keys because she planned to use her social benefits and a school loan to buy a new car. However, investigators discovered that Leith had actually been staying at a different hotel, making it unlikely that he spent nights in the car, especially considering the snow during that period. On February 3rd, police found a debit card with Sony's name, along with several recent purchase receipts inside the car. On the same day, police examined the clothes that had been stored at the hotel, searching for DNA or other evidence, but they found nothing. This lack of progress added to their frustrations, and as a result, Leith had to be released due to insufficient evidence linking him to Sony's disappearance. Meanwhile, Sony's cousin and her mother had the painful task of going to the hotel to collect Sony's belongings. Sony's cousin had a terrible premonition, but unfortunately, she did not find anything to support her feelings. On February 4th, the police went to Moody's uncle's house, where they found a DVD player that had been taken from the hotel room in Sony's wallet. Moody had given these items to his cousin, who told the police that Leith had borrowed the DVD player on January 24th, saying he wanted to watch a movie. Leith was seen driving a red car that day. Later, when the cousin asked Leith why he hadn't picked up the children on January 27th, Leith avoided the question. When asked about Sony, Leith left the DVD player and wallet in a bag, and quickly left the house. James and Rhonda Sargent asked to be moved from room 222 because of the constant bad smell. Since no other rooms were available, they had to move to a different hotel. However, even after the room was cleaned and the carpet was washed in early February, subsequent guests in room 222 still complained about the foul smell, which only slightly improved for a few days. Soni's family, especially her kids, were devastated by her disappearance. Their only hope was for her safe return. On February 4th, homicide detectives visited the hotel where Soni was last seen. By then, her room had been occupied and cleaned at least 3 times. The detectives didn't enter the room, but asked the staff if they had noticed anything unusual, and all said no. On February 7th, James and Rhonda, probably relatives or friends of Soni, returned to the hotel and changed rooms 3 times, including one night in room 222, which was the same room Soni had stayed in. They told the management that the room still smelled bad. In March, a deeper cleaning of room 222 was carried out, including the carpets, bedding, bathroom curtains, and window drapes. But to everyone's surprise, the smell didn't go away. It got stronger. The manager talked to the security guard about the issue, and during their conversation, they remembered that Soni had vanished at the end of January. The guard recalled the events from that time and suggested that the manager check room 222 for signs of blood or cleaning products. 10 minutes later, the manager returned and asked the guard to come with him. What they found was horrifying. The 2 men walked into the room to find that the manager had removed the mattress from one bed, leaving only the frame behind. The lower part of the bed frame had a built-in enclosure, which prevented the space underneath from being used as a storage area. However, when they lifted the box spring, they discovered a large empty space that could conceal anything. As they peered through the solid edges of the frame, they stumbled upon a gruesome sight, a decomposing body. They immediately called the police, who arrived at the scene shortly after. Upon inspection, the bed frame was found to have marks all over it, with 2 broken wooden areas near the headboard. A towel and a cloth bag were discovered between the legs of the body, which was dressed in a shirt, but was naked from the waist down. The autopsy conducted by the forensic team revealed that the cause of death was strangulation using a coaxial cable. The cable was wrapped around the victim's neck, under one arm, around the chest, and ended at the back. According to the forensic examiner, would have taken at least 2 to 3 minutes of continuous pressure to cause death. DNA analysis matched Soni's genetic profile, which included female markers. Additionally, male genetic material was found on 5 parts of the cable. The main theory was that Soni was already dead when she was reported missing, and that Leith had used the coaxial cable from the DVD player he had borrowed from his cousin, suggesting premeditation. Leith was detained by the police shortly after, although not for the discovery of Soni's body. He was arrested on a separate charge of possessing a firearm, despite a prior felony conviction. Despite this, he was considered a person of interest at the time of his arrest, as he was the last person seen with Soni alive. Furthermore, he was found in Soni's car when he was arrested and taken to the detention facility in Mason on March 18th. The police have launched an internal investigation to find out why the case took such an unusual turn. They acknowledged that the family deserved answers and explained that despite their eagerness to solve the case, the officers had taken a wrong turn that led them away from the room. The police also stated that they had never dealt with a situation like this before, saying that the discovery was more astonishing than fiction, and highlighted the tragedy of domestic violence. However, they regretted that the room had been cleaned and rented out multiple times since Soni's death, which made it difficult for them to collect evidence. Rhonda, one of the first tenants to occupy the room where Soni's body was found, expressed skepticism about the police explanation when she spoke to the media. She pointed out that if the officers had asked to enter the room during their January visit, she and her husband would have let them in. Rhonda argued that unlike her and her husband, the officers should have been able to recognize the smell of a decomposing body and found Soni much sooner. Finally, the time arrived to bid a loving and dignified farewell to Soni. On March 24th, her funeral took place. Following her death, Soni's children were placed in the care of her sister and brother-in-law. By April 1st, they had begun the process of obtaining legal guardianship of the children. She acknowledged that while the children were the primary victims of the tragedy, the lives of all family members were severely disrupted. She vowed that although she couldn't bring her sister back, she was resolute in providing for Soni's children, ensuring they received the necessities like food, clothing, and toys, and keeping them together as a family unit. Soni had benefited from a social program that refilled her debit card for grocery purchases on a regular basis. Shortly before her disappearance, the card was replenished as part of her tax refund. The police were able to track the card's movements, which led them to Leith, who was found with the card. Their investigation showed that the card was used on February 1st, for days after Sony went missing. At a convenience store she regularly visited on the 1st of each month to withdraw cash using her electronic benefit transfer card. The police visited the store and asked the owner to share the footage from the 16 security cameras. The surveillance system had captured footage of a man wearing yellow clothing using Sony's card at 11:38 a.m. on February 1st. He bought a bottle of orange juice, withdrew some cash and purchased a cigar. After making the purchases, the man returned to a car driven by another person. In February 2014, nearly 4.5 years after the crime, Leith's trial finally began. By this time, the Budget Lodge hotel where the couple had stayed had closed down. Leith maintained his innocence, while the prosecutor described the events as a tragic and ugly culmination of a tumultuous relationship. In contrast, the defense attorney highlighted the lack of concrete evidence, including witnesses and physical proof, and disputed the prosecution's speculations. The defense attorney brought to attention a crucial piece of evidence, a fingerprint found on the bed frame that did not belong to Leith, suggesting the possibility of an alternate perpetrator. He also mentioned that Sony had been involved with other men in the past, which could have led to her murder. The attorney emphasized that Leith had no prior arrests for domestic violence against Sony. Furthermore, he revealed that Sony had moved back in with Leith due to a rat infestation at a relative's house where she was previously staying. On February 6th, a video was shown in court which captured Leith using a prepaid Sony card just 4 days after the murder. While the defense team suggested that Leith's calm behavior during the transaction suggested he was innocent, the prosecution saw it as a sign of a cold-blooded and ruthless individual who was unbothered by the crime he had allegedly committed. On February 7, 2014, Leith was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. 3 days later, on February 10th, Leith appealed the sentence, arguing that the court had made an error by considering his past history of domestic violence, and that the evidence presented was insufficient. However, on July 7, 2015, the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the conviction, confirming the sentence.